We are beginning. All right. So I'll try to. We already had an exam, so we'll take it. I mean, I hope to just get this in an hour and be okay after that. Unless anyway, and we already have a volunteer. It's your fault. It is very non-invasive. We'll do that at the end, so I can show you what an electrocardiogram looks like. And so let me do the presentation part of this now. There we are. And really, this is trying to understand a little bit about the electrical events surrounding this. And I see that, well, that's probably as close as they added this board. This must be relatively recent. It was here, and then we lost it. Now it's back. Okay. So, long story short. So we're going to look at this as really and that's what this lab is about. The last part of it, and you could spend a very long time looking at electrocardiograms. For the longest time, they were sort of the gold standard in being able to analyze what was going on with somebody. And I think of late they've been de-emphasized a little bit, but I think it's important to know about them. That's there. And I don't know that everybody does this. I mean, even before we had the technology, I did a whole unit on this. But I thought that this would be helpful to you. We are getting ready for whatever the first practical is going to be. And I will take a look and see what I need to cover. I may still have to do blood vessels next week. Not that necessarily that difficult to get that done. So this is basically what's going on here with this. So we called it the intrinsic cardiac conduction system. And gap junctions are specialized contexts that allow charged particles. And so effectively, all the cells of the heart are interconnected. Okay? Every one of them. That's the very interesting part about this. So when one part of the heart beats, then whatever cell starts, it will, from wherever it is, it will complete the beat for the duration. And that's the whole idea of why we have those automatic defibrillators in hospitals, and schools, and malls, things like that. We have it there because it's really been a great assist in dealing with cardiac arrest. So, yeah, and the odds of survival are greatly, greatly increased, even more so than starting CPR. If it's a rhythm, and then we'll look at these, that is best if it's defibrillated, that really increases significantly the odds of survival. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of information about this stuff, and it's useful to know. Those devices work by themselves. I mean, the instructions are there. All you have to do is put the paddles on, turn it on, and it will basically do it because it will read the rhythm. It'll charge it to the appropriate. Most important thing you want to do is not be touching the person directly, or else you're going to get a charge. And those are really they're pretty violent and things like that. And it's if you've ever seen it, most of us have seen it like in the movies or on a TV show. But if you see it in real life, I mean, in the old days, I mean, those paddles, people would literally jump off the table, even though they were comatose. They would be almost like lifted up. It's remarkable. So it's all about this conduction system, and there are the pieces that go along with it. They're called autorhythmic cells, and effectively they're leaky. Normally, resting membrane potentials are stable, but these cells have leaky membranes, and sodium kind of leaks in, and it gradually makes the cell more positive and brings it to what we call threshold. And I'm sure in AP1 you learned quite a bit about action potentials and threshold, right? Those are ringing a bell. So as we get close to that, it causes a cell to fire. And that's basically what you're going to see here. And the whole idea is if it's done normally, and I'll explain what normal is, and then we'll kind of take a look at how you interpret these. The interesting thing today, and it happened to me, is that these are read now automatically. They're computer read. And the problem with that is that sometimes you get false evidence. I mean, maybe I told you the anecdote, is that I went and started yelling at my doctor a couple of years ago because he said there's evidence of a heart attack. And then after it, the next sentence says, same as last time, where there was no evidence for heart attack. And I'm like, well, as I would say to my doctor in terms of endearment, WTF are you talking about? I won't explain. And so basically, and he told me all about this being machine read. He said, and he looked at it, he goes, I normally, he is not the one who read it. So maybe that's, he's retired now. I'm sure that bothered him. So it's called unstable resting membrane potentials. So you can see him here. As soon as the action potential is reached and then it repolarizes, it doesn't just stay there like we would see typically in a muscle cell or in a nerve cell. It immediately starts to creep back up to threshold, moreover, at a predictable rate. That's what we call pacemaker potential. And there's a couple of areas in your heart that have that potential. And so without going into all the nuances, here are the parts of the heart. 3 of these have pacemaker potential. Only one of them really works effectively, and it's called the SA or sinoatrial node. And this whole thing takes less than a quarter of a second. And then the heart always rests for about a quarter of a second. So there's a lot of room for heart rate, and that's part of cardiac fitness. When somebody it's all about the reserve. Highly trained athletes, endurance athletes, they have, and young folks like you, many of you have heart rates under 60. In someone of my age, that would be abnormal. That would be, we call it bradycardic. Brady means slow. Tachy means fast. And under 60 normally means your heart's not beating rapidly enough. But in a young person or an athletic person, that gives you a tremendous amount of reserve, okay, for the activities that you're doing. So the SA node is the pacemaker. It sets the tempo, so to speak. And it's designed to be typically, 60 to 100 is normal. Like I said, with exceptions for athletic individuals. But for most of you, if we did it randomly right now, most of you are where you should be in 60 days. Resting heart rate is a really good, simple assessment for how healthy people are. And again, for young people, it's a little less reliable. I did a lot of teaching at community colleges for many years while I was transitioning until I started to work here full time. So I've been working here full time for about 15 years. And even then, they have a lot of non-traditional students, people in their 40s and 50s going back, mostly to get nursing degrees. That's what I encountered at CCAC and Butler and Westmoreland Community Colleges, where I taught all of these places. And so we'd have them do this, check their pulse, very easy to do, and we'd sort of map it out if they didn't mind disclosing what the numbers were. And the reality was that there were a number of people who were in that 80 to 100. That's not good. That's somebody who's not in good shape. That's somebody, I was so ill when I was smoking so heavily and weighed considerably more than this, that, my heart rate at one point was about 106 for resting heart rate. When I was probably in my mid-40s. Very unhealthy. I'll blame my first one. No, I shouldn't. It's my fault. I kind of blame somebody. So normally it's in the right atrium, and it basically sends the signal down the road. Next stopping point is called the AV node. It's in what's called the interatrial septum. So the SA node is in the right atrium. This is in the divider between the 2 atrial chambers. This is what I call the rate determining step. This is the part that's slowest by intent. It has less of those gap junctions, and the signal is designed to go relatively slowly through there. It takes around maybe 0.1 to 0.2. So the vast majority of the time of this beat is spent going from here to here and then finally down to the next step. That allows, and you might remember me telling you about that, the atria to contract and top off the ventricles. The whole idea of a heart working properly is that you get the maximum sort of bang for your buck. That the ventricles are filled optimally so they can eject the appropriate amount of heart consistently every beat. It's all about repetitive nature. Once it gets through here, okay, so this has, just to complete the thought, this has a maximum beat of its own of 50. If somebody has, for instance, a heart attack and this doesn't work, now that'll take over. The trouble is 50 beats a minute is enough to sustain life, but you don't, and again, unless somebody was a trained athlete, for someone, a middle-aged person, they can't do very much of anything. They'd have trouble walking up the stairs. They'd have trouble taking a bunch of groceries out of the car and bringing them to the house, that kind of stuff. So you'd be very limited in your activity, but you could survive. So, and you'll see that we call this a junctional or nodal, N-O-D-A-L, rhythm, indicating it's coming from this node. Once it gets through here, super fast. It goes all the way down a bundle in the interatrial and interventricular septum, and it branches and it goes all the way down to the tip of the heart and sort of surrounds it by what's called, we used to call them Purkinje fibers. They're called subendocardial conducting network now. Purkinje fibers, everybody will know what you mean. And that sends that impulse from the tip of the heart, the apex, all the way around. And if you remember that interesting diagram where it had the spiraling fibers around the heart, it'll literally squeeze it from the bottom to the top because the blood ejects from the top. Very, very rapid. That could sustain a rhythm about 30 beats per minute. You can't survive with that. So, and what will happen inevitably if there's a very severe heart attack, what will occur is that individual will effectively, sooner or later, there's not enough blood getting back to the heart to support it, and it's going to go into, eventually the heart's going to stop beating. I'll show you the rhythms that are there. So here's the pacemaker in the atrial wall. Typically, the quote-unquote normal number for most of us, about 75 beats per minute. Understand that our bodies, when we're healthy, is a series of governors, meaning it holds them in check. Okay? When you're healthy, the healthier you are, the more your autonomic nervous system, read that as the vagus nerve, holds your heart, because inherently the beat would be over 100. So the healthier you are, the more that you're holding back excessive beats that are there. The atria, then the next beat goes to that AV node in the intraatrial septum, where it delays it a good 1/10 of a second. We look at that interval. Fibers are smaller, gap junctions are less. The atria contract prior to the ventricle. The inherent rate of about 50 per minute in the absence, as I said to you, but not enough to really do much activity. Once it gets through there, there's one connection between the atria and the ventricles. That's the AV bundle. Years ago, we called it the bundle of His. That's how it's pronounced. It's a proper name for whoever the scientist is who identified that. Even if somebody has an artificial pacemaker, they have to put leads in the atria and leads in the ventricle because they're not connected. If that's not functioning, then it branches, and then it goes to the Purkinje fibers. And so that whole process of the electrical activity, and always remember, in everything, electrical events precede mechanical events. That electrical activity that we see accumulated in the electrocardiogram effectively always is going to come before the muscles start to contract. And that's the classic diagram that you will undoubtedly see on the practical. Pardon me. Here's the SA node, the AV node, the bundle branches, and all the way down. When it doesn't work properly, we have a name. It's called an arrhythmia. And so you hear about that, and that's one of the things we really look out for, because those are folks who are prone to forming blood clots, to being close to having a heart attack, something like that. You want to have a, quote, normal rhythm. Fibrillation, a very famous term, is the heart beats very rapidly, either at the atria or particularly the ventricles, and it's very inefficient. And so the whole idea of defibrillating is you want to fire, because all the muscles are firing randomly. is basically the defibrillator discharges all the electrical activity, resets it. It's like in your house and you flipped a circuit breaker and flipped it back on. And now all of a sudden, with any good luck, the SA node, assuming it's healthy, will reset itself and take over. And you see it, and you'll see them on TV, and you may have to do it a couple of times for that individual, and they'll say, oh, look, they're in sinus rhythm. And I'll show you what that means. That's the idea. So then you have a life-sustaining rhythm, and then you can figure out what's going on with people. It's scary when you see it. So when the SA node doesn't work, fancy name is called an ectopic focus. Ectopic means it's not where it's supposed to be, and typically it's in that AV node. We call it a junctional rhythm. Every so often, and you and I can get this all the time, called extrasystole. It's an irregular beat. It's like a big beat. And particularly, I mean, if you're like me, I mean, in the morning I start off with 3 or 4 cups of coffee. And for years, I drank that all the time in caffeinated beverages. And every so often, you get, all of a sudden, I'd be able to feel that. That was there. And considering I was a smoker, you add the two of them together, not terribly healthy. Still, I still am a big coffee drinker. So, if there's a problem getting through that AV node, we call it a heart block because the signal is not getting through. It's blocked. It can be delayed, and these are fancy terms that you may or may not have to know about. These are, if it's delayed slightly, we call it a first-degree block. If it's delayed in such a way that one signal gets through and another one doesn't, we call that a second-degree heart block. And then sometimes it doesn't get through third degree or a total heart block. That's when we have that nodal rhythm where the AV node has to take over. These days, they use a lot of pacemakers. Years ago, they used medications. The medications were very harsh. And so the technology in pacemakers has improved. And there's centers that control this in the autonomic nervous system. They're just showing you. This is more of the physiological aspect. We'll deal with this a little bit in lecture, because we'll do the lecture portion of that with regard to these different channels without getting into a lot of the electrical back. But in this case, calcium is a big player. The big players that we look for in labs, and I showed you my labs, potassium and calcium are really important with those levels when it comes to the heart. And it goes through all of these. The action potential in a skeletal muscle is a couple of milliseconds. In the heart, it's about 200. It's roughly not quite a quarter, as I said before, a quarter of a second. So that sustained contraction, what's useful about that is it ensures that we're going to get the blood pumped out the way it's supposed to. And without getting crazy about the chart, okay, what you begin to see, this is the electrical activity. It has this plateau. That's due to the calcium. And that makes sure that you get it's not like a spike that we see with skeletal muscles. It's much more of a plateau, okay? So it's a much more sustained kind of a contraction. And this is really important. The heart has a very long, what's called absolute refractory period. The heart cannot possibly beat again. So you hear somebody, oh, I went to the gym and I worked out and I got my heart rate up to 300. You can't. It's physiologically impossible. If you're using one of the devices on a treadmill, you're holding on to it, or a pulse-taking device, you're not that, you'll get an odd number. I think theoretically the highest number it could be is 233. For most people, when they go to the gym and work out and they're doing cardio, you want to get it. The easiest thing you can do, you can take 220, subtract your age. So I'm 72, so let's say I take 70 to make it easy. It's 150. Take 80% of that, 120. So when I go, I try to get my heart rate between 120 and 130, that area. And if you can sustain that for X amount of time, typically 20 to 30 minutes, which you should be able to do. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Listen to music. Yeah, that's what I do. Dancing along with my wife at the gym goes somewhere. What's he do? I have no idea who that is. I wouldn't know him if I fell. Okay. And that's what this is all about. We take all of the action potentials around the heart, and you'll hear the term EKG or ECG. I learned EKG. They're both the same word. Cardio from the German is with a K. Cardio from English is with a C. So all the action potentials, and I'll show you what it looks like. So let me escape from this, and go over here. If you're really interested, if you want to learn a little bit about it, this is a very easy, it's called ecglibrary.com. Been around forever. It shows you what we call a 12-lead cardiogram. In here, we're just going to have 2 leads and a ground. Basically, what cardiograms can do is they would put, and you'd see it all the time, someone will come in, you'll put a lead here and a lead here, okay, on their chest, okay. In the old days, we'd do on their limbs, wrists and ankles, and you put a sensor there, and basically you put the leads. And so what you were doing, you have 2 active leads, a positive, negative, and a ground. So you'd be creating a series of triangles. And those triangles, you'd assimilate those depending on what leads you used. So when you look at a normal cardiogram like this, so normally in a hospital, if you see it on a TV show or a monitor in a hospital, typically it's lead 2. So you have lead 1, lead 2, and lead 3. So generally you put a little marker there. And we used to have a device that could do that, but it never worked here. It was very much, we got it for free anyway. And then AVR, AVL, and AVF, those were picking out different triangles based on those limb leads. Then there you'll see it, and I'll show an illustration. They're called precordial leads. So I had surgery in June 1st. So sometime in the middle of May, I went over to I live in Cranberry by Cranberry North, Cranberry Passivant Hospital over there. And they basically do that, and then they put a series of leads called precordial leads where they're looking for specific areas around the heart. And they do the test, and they send you home. So those leads give you these different ones: V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, and V6. That's a 12-lead EKG. It's all about the little squares. So it's hard for me to get up because of the wires. But those little squares, the big boxes, represent roughly a 1/5 of a second. Each of the tiny squares in the box is 0.04. So 5 of those larger boxes is a second. And that's how you can read these things fairly easily if you look at the numbers. And so how would I know this? And it's hard. I don't have the luxury of being able to. You can see the cursor. It's here. Okay. So let's look at that. So roughly you can see 5 of those that are there. And so you want it to be less than a second normally. So maybe this is 21 or 22 of those little boxes. It's going to be approximately 70, 75, 80 beats per minute normal. What do we see associated with? That's called a P wave. This is a QRS complex. The very tip is called the R, and that's a T wave. Normal heart, you have P, QRS, T. Then you have a rest period, you refract, and we start all over again. P, QRS, T. And as long as you have that, and it's within that between 60 and 100, we call that a normal sinus rhythm. Normal, because it's between 60 and 100. Not too fast, not too slow. Sinus means the P wave precedes the QRS. That's what normal sinus rhythm. That's what you look for. The normal is the 60 to 100. The sinus is a P followed by a QRS. So that's just a little part of this. Now, we take that information And this is very interesting. I never knew about this till I went, and it's called the electrical axis-star. Till I did a program when I was still a student down at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. And one of the interns, they just graduated, showing me this. He has a little notebook, and he's showing me all this stuff. And he says, we look at the QRS complex if it's pointing up in lead one and in lead and this lead that's here, VE. Okay. So if it's both 1 and AVF are positive, that's called normal. So normally the heart, the electrical activity should be, because the bulk of the heart is down and to the left. So that's normal. And it tells you there's all the different things it could be. So you can take a quick snapshot and see whether it deviates to the right. Maybe it's up here to the left. Maybe it's up here. And then there's all sorts of different things that can be it might be as simple as you put the leads on wrong. That's why we always check them. Okay, so if it's over to the right, maybe you have the right ventricle is enlarged. Maybe it's just a child or a tall, thin adult. Maybe it's chronic lung disease. So you get a little info. And then you can go back and look at this and you can look at what a heart attack looks like. So acute anterior myocardial infarction. You see these massive waves. That doesn't look normal. So if you're interested, the nursing students are a little more interested in this because a lot of them, if they want to work in critical care, like OR, ER, intensive care, you have to certify in this. There's a week-long course that they did at UPMC when my first wife started to work there. And my first wife had a BSN, an RN and a BSN that she got later. When she went to work at Shadyside Hospital, then you had to do these week-long courses in EKGs and cardiac meds. It's the same thing that you have if you're in a licensed field. They're going to ask for your credentials, the vetting process. It's about liability and things. Same thing here. I have to send them all my grades and my degrees and all that stuff. So, whenever we apply for a job. So that's all part of it. So if you're interested, take a gander at that. I just wanted to acquaint. I do it a little more elaborately with my advanced physiology students, but there's no reason other than to give you the lowdown on what it is. So back here, so these are the leads. And so those are the ones, the P wave, I'll show them to you again, QRS and T. We look at this interval to see if it's too slow or too fast. Typically too slow, that's one of those heart block things. We look at the ST segment because it really points pretty well as to whether or not there's some irregularity, particularly as the ventricles, what we call repolarize. So they have different meanings. The P wave is the electrical activity of the atrium, depolarizing. When it resets itself, okay, it's obscured by that big peak called the QRS. That's the ventricles depolarizing, and you can't see the atrium. The T wave is the ventricles repolarizing. We look a lot at that interval to see how efficiently the ventricles, which are the big pumping chambers, fire and then reset. And we see irregularities. We'll see elevation or depression. So that's what one of those looks like. So typically, they'd have done something like that to me. And then you can see these. So here's that PR interval from when the P wave starts to when that peak starts to generate. So this is QRS. So we look for that, and it should be between 3 and 5 of those little squares. If it's longer than that, something's up. The ST segment should be nice because what happens is the Q wave goes down just a smidge because it's such a vigorous electrical activity. Then you get the distinct R and then the S. So that ST segment should be relatively flat going to the T wave. If it's elevated or overly depressed, that suggests maybe some damage to the heart. And so there's other ways now we can look for heart attacks that are a little more sophisticated than back when I started looking at these things 50 years ago. All we had was the echocardiograms, and you'd have to do them. You do them 3 times a day over 3 days and look for changes. You look for enzymes over 3 days and look for changes. Now we can do blood tests right away and see if heart muscle cells are damaged. They're just showing you what each of these events are. So we look for irregularities. So if that big peak is excessively high, it typically means an enlarged heart. The most common cause of enlarged heart, high blood pressure. And high blood pressure, everybody, a lot of times is silent until all of a sudden it's a 5-alarm fire. People don't know that. So I probably told you, I take 2 blood pressure medicines, done so for years, every day. My dad had high blood pressure. His dad had high blood pressure. Nothing unusual about it. Most folks, you get 70 years, typically you've got some kind of several medicines you're on. So elevated or depressed STs, and I'll show you what that looks like. And we look at various kinds. So this is the classic normal rhythm. Again, P wave, QRS, T wave. You have roughly, if you count the squares, 17 or so. That's roughly a beat of about 75. Okay. And again, your heart beats more rapidly than once a second, every second of your life, normal. The junctional rhythm, look at the space. Now you got 5 squares plus. So this is like 25, maybe up to 30. That's why, and you don't see any P waves. So every so often the AV node is taking over, and that's not enough to be. And look at that depression there. It's a mess. This is a kind of heart block. First of all, the EKG is not very impressive. Not a lot of oomph here. Okay, so obviously there's something wrong. But look, P wave, QRS, T wave, P wave, nothing. Then the next one, P wave, QRS, T wave, and then P wave, nothing. So it's every other beat. Fancy name is second degree, and that one's called a 2-to-1 heart block. For every 2 P waves, you get 1. That's not great. Now, some people, you'll feel if you're taking somebody's pulse, mine included, every so often it'll skip a beat. Don't know. I mean, my wife noticed that when she was doing that. For whatever reason, I marry nurses. Sad. Not at the same time. That's illegal. That would be bigamy. Actually, bigamy. Okay. These jokes I've been doing for 20 years, shamelessly rehearsed in front of a mirror. There's nothing spontaneous. She goes, "You're missing a beat." I said, Sorry, she doesn't like the music I listen to. She tells me I listen to elevator music. I listen old stuff. She listens. Her first husband listened to the same music. And this is the very famous V-fib. And it's almost like they call it a bag of worms. It's like if you could magically feel the heart. It's almost like you were going fishing and you got a bag of worms in a paper bag and they'd be moving around. That was really the analogy of it. And that's a shockable or defibrillatable rhythm. That's it. So we'll do this other stuff when we get into lecture about systole and diastole and the filling times and what makes the heart work. And you should be familiar with it. And everybody, this is the whole picture is right. We'll sit here and we'll get to lecture after I do the blood unit. And because next week in lab, we'll do the blood vessels. But from a lecture perspective, this is the whole heart right here. Understanding the relationship between the electrical activity and the mechanical activity, filling and emptying. And so that's a really useful slide. I've always felt that was like one slide that could explain everything. So I'll stop it here and I'll go back and show you so we can and how we would do a cardiogram. Now, hopefully it'll work, and I'm not guaranteeing it will. The problem with this room, and And if I really want to do one of these that's right, I would make sure that we had like a regular classroom, but the typical rooms are not available. So this is kind of what it looks like. And I'll see if I can find one for you in my notes. And I have it set up, iWorks here. So EEG, Evan ECG1 from a couple of years. And I have no idea. I don't recall it at all. So here you go. So we have two things, thank you. So this is, you might recall the cardiogram. It was a perfectly healthy person, but it's very difficult if someone's not moving or moving around excessively, there can be a problem. That's there. So we were also measuring pulse at the same time. So you're able to then get an idea of, let's say, the pulse interval, which typically would be very consistent. So you take a pulse peak. So if you see irregularities, I tend to dismiss them. And then we can look over here. So effectively, here's a beat so it's more frequently than once a second. The in-between beats is like 0.86 seconds. So and that's great. And then you can see P wave, QRS, T wave, even though they're not irregular, but it's very difficult. We've always felt in this room, and hopefully they're going to do something about it, that there's inherently vibrations, and that messes this up. I get better results when I'm able to do it in a lab that doesn't have this massive sound, but nothing I can do about that. So that's kind of what we'd like to do. So we'd like to do a new one. No, I don't want to save that because I already have it. So there we are. And so I'll give you the lowdown on how we set this up and the language. And you don't have to report on this or anything. I just want to show it to you so you get an idea how it can be accomplished rather simplistically. I'm getting there. Just ignore me. And this is one of these foundation things. And the design is such that, and what I have done with this in the past, and which I do with some of my advanced physiology students, we would take this equipment, and I even have some handheld equipment, and we would, and if you're not familiar with that, there's a building down there that used to be the fitness center, like down below Hale and Franklin, whatever it is now, maybe Student Health, whatever building that is. That used to be a fitness center before they built that nice one up there. And so we used to carry the stuff over there. Stupid. All right, so I have all this set up, okay? And so what we'll do is we'll have somebody who's already volunteered. Thank you very much. And we're going to put the red one on your left wrist here, the black one on your right wrist, and the green one, let's say on your leg. Can you handle that? Are you willing to participate in this? God bless you. You won't even, even going to give you new ones. So the green one goes on your legs. What do you think tonight? Green bears. Put any money on that? No, I don't. My son and I are in a favorable position in a very expensive suicide. So they started with almost 500 people at like $50 top. So after the fees and everything, we each have 2 entries still left because of all the upsets. Please split. And he makes a lot more money than us. Should. Okay, green one on, doesn't matter which leg. Pick a leg. No, I don't think so. At least you're not and the wrist. So as you can see, so and we'll do it right. The red one on your left wrist here, the black one on your left. Okay. We'll see if she's right. And when you're finally doing this, you want to be very, you want to just be as relaxed as possible. Okay. Good help. The lazy group. Okay, place the pulse sensor on the fleshy part of your thumb or middle finger. We'll do the middle finger. Did I? Same to you, buddy. And yesterday, my wife, unfortunately, she met with this guy from the water authority. Turned out to be really nice, so she didn't have to tell him. Goodness. Oh, don't mess. Okay. So you want jewelry there. This has it should be snugger than looser. I think would be the way. The thumb has its own pulse, and this pick it up. So this is just a sensor picking up pulse dial. So we normally you would do it resting, and then after activity, we'll just do it resting and see what we can come up with. After leg exercise, right? Now I've done this. I was years ago. I taught at IUP, and they had a really good setup for this. And I mean, the almost had like an exercise bike you could do it with, and then be able. So it was really. I wish we could do that here. That's why I like to use that. And so let's see, 0. Let's do get ready. Okie dokie. Down here. I'm going to do this. This will just be temporary. Just be as relaxed as possible. Even your hands can be, even supported like that. We'll be fine. We'll see. Okay. You see, and that you can just make it out a little bit. Let's try that again. I'll discard that. That's getting a little better over there. The pulse isn't working so good. Let's try your thumb. And occasionally it doesn't work so well, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. Let's see if we get that a little bit better. Yeah, all right. 2,000 beats per minute. You're really. Let's uncross your hands. Let me do this again. We'll stop it again. See if we can get this a little better. Yeah. So if you can't, you have enough to play in that. Should have told me. Right. Here. Here. Okay. Yeah, so now we're getting a little bit better. Yeah, there. So you can see 70 beats, 68 beats per minute. That's very good. Even if it's calculating the number for us. Oh, that's good. Now, so I mean, you can measure any one of a, so for instance, we would measure, let's say if this is P, and you can see you're looking at 200 or so milliseconds, so that's relatively, it's in the normal range, given what we're trying to accomplish with this. And and if we, again, if you can get a really good one, and that's the hard part. Let's see if I can compact that a little bit. That's too long. Let's get the long way. Okay. And that's what you try to do, is to try to find maybe a representative example. And I don't know if that's it or not. We'll see. Yeah. So it's generally 0.12. Okay. That's 300. That's a little bit long. So I think that's more of a problem with that. We'll try once more. So try to make your hands as relaxed as possible. I know it's not that necessarily that easy. Does everybody see what's kind of going on there? So, will it? You're going to make it through the class. Let's try again. Yeah, I mean, and that's fine. I wish the P wave would come a little more distinctly. I mean, the average of beats per minute 76, which is fine. Maybe if we look at it this way, and I'll try to get another one of these, more or less estimated. And that's what I mean by a little bit of because the vibration comes through in the benches. So even that's a little longer than I would like. Oops. So everybody see what I'm doing? I'm just trying to move the cursor. There you go. So if that's an average one, it should be between 0.12 or 120 to 200. That's 170. And the heart rate is fine, whatever that turns out to be, because there's some variation with that thing on a finger. That's basically what you do. So it gives you a snapshot. Now, so theoretically, if we had the luxury of having, let's say, a stationary bike, and temporarily could just unhook you enough, like snap the thing, leave the leads on, leave the sticky stuff on, go on the bike for 5 or 10 minutes, come back, and then basically do it again. We could see how high the pulse went to, and then really the best measure of health is how rapidly it goes back to normal. So for instance, I mean, I look at myself at the gym, and so if I get it up to that 120, 125, it's a while before that gets back down, and then that just goes with the territory. I did a distance runner when I was at IUP. She ran up and downstairs. I can't even tell you how many times. And then we got her back on basically the leads, and it was like the heart rate went back down to normal. She was like a distance runner, like on the cross country team. It's ridiculous. Please keep it up there. Nope, can't happen. It's very, very fit, obviously. So, everybody, you get the idea? Are you? Thank you for being a participant. Now on public. So you can just peel those off, and I'll throw out everything that's there. So that's really all we needed to do so far. Okay. Hey, got you saved. All right.